I want to bring in two people who've been following this trial closely throughout these first few weeks. David Henderson, a civil rights attorney and former prosecutor, and Katie Phang, an MSNBC legal analyst, former prosecutor for Broward County and Miami-Dade County. Katie, maybe I'll start with you. Just let's start with today in the Medical Examiner. I know, again, there's always been sort of a trial narrative and a public narrative. And I know that, again, this sort of coterie of apologists who've attempted to kind of spin away the plain truth of what we've seen have tried to say that, well, the Medical Examiner's report shows that this was complicated and it wasn't the police officer that actually killed George Floyd. And that seemed to be part of the kind of implication in the back and forth today. What was the goal for the prosecution, the defense today in those exchanges?
So the goal today was to continue to do what we've seen so far with the medical testimony in this case, which has been this elegant choreography in terms of the presentation of what is otherwise very complex and very kind of complicated medical concepts that are reduced to easily digestible ideas for the members of the jury. And that is what the state has done exceptionally well over the last couple of days. We saw it through Dr. Tobin, the pulmonologist. We saw it with Dr. Thomas, the forensic pathologist who actually trained Dr. Baker. And even though Dr. Baker was not as maybe elegant as the other witnesses, he delivered the final punch today on behalf of the prosecution. Now, the defense did what it could possibly do, which is create as much reasonable doubt as possible. And that's what I kind of want to remind everybody, Chris, right? At the end of the day, it's the state's burden to prove to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt their case. And if the defense can get just one juror, just one, to hold out and not find Derek Chauvin guilty of any one of the three charges he's facing, then you're not going to get a guilty verdict. But what's important in terms of a takeaway from today's medical testimony is the following. There are going to be jury instructions that are going to be read to the members of the jury before they deliberate. And within these jury instructions is a definition of cause, causation, to cause, because we heard a lot about,
right.
Is it the primary cause of death, et cetera. And the jury instructions itself state that to cause it, it doesn't have to be the only thing, as long as it's a substantial causal factor in the death. It can be one of many, but as long as it's substantial, then that can carry the day for the prosecution. And so I think, Chris, all of the hay that's being made by the defense about pre-existing heart conditions, drugs in the system, it's not going to work. I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, I have to say, in a non-legal sense, Dave, right? So watching this, and this was true even before the trial, watching the trial, right? I mean, if you imagine a situation in which someone were to run up on an elderly person and punch them with all their force, and that person were to hit the ground and die from their injuries, and then it turned out that they were on blood thinner, or they had a heart condition, or they were just out of the hospital, it would hardly seem exculpatory to say, well, they had a lot of, health conditions, and that was really the reason. It's like, well, you punched the person. That's the proximate cause here. That's the thing we're prosecuting. So I've had a hard time sifting through the legal significance as against these three charges about what the state has to show vis-a-vis cause to get the highest charge that they're gunning for.
Well, Chris, I like the way you put that. And what you have to focus on is what's necessary to prove each one of these charges individually. So let's start with the highest charge, the second-degree murder charge. Remember, it's an unintentional murder charge. He's charged for committing murder as a result of assaulting George Floyd. So you have to prove that he intentionally assaulted him. When you move down to the third-degree charge, you basically have to prove that he did something that placed George Floyd at imminent risk with a depraved mind, which is a recklessness standard, more or less. There's a heightened risk that the conduct is going to result in a particular cause. Then you move down to the manslaughter charge, and essentially it's a negligence standard. Where did you behave the way a reasonable person would have under the circumstances? But here's the thing. None of that means absolutely anything in real life. Lawyers come up with terminology to describe different types of conduct, but here's what it's like. It's like me talking to my wife and saying, I love you. And she says, no, I love you more. And I say, you know what? I love you to the moon and back. How much more is I love you to the moon and back versus I love you more?
Right.
We talk about these tricky legal standards, but they don't mean that much. And so ultimately,
right,
what it matters,
I guess to the extent.
I'm so sorry. I thought
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say what it comes down to is what is the jury's gut reaction to what they're saying? And I think we've established that Derek Chauvin deserves to be convicted. I think that causation and intent is less clear, but in a case this strong, it may not matter.
Yeah, that's so well put, because I mean, obviously there is, there is a sort of technical legal distinction between the three charges and the threshold the state has to meet, Katie. But then, we're dealing with the human enterprise of a jury, and it's a jury that we should note again, the context here, which, gives me a little bit of a pit in my stomach, is that it's a jury that's been screened for having zero or minimal knowledge of what was probably the most ubiquitous and significant news event in many, many years. So I don't know what's inside the minds of those jurors. And to Dave's point, I mean, the sort of technical question of causation seems less important than was this okay, what happened or not, which was kind of the case, right?
Yeah. And so listen, you do want that fair and impartial jury, right? You want that jury that's going to go in with no preconceived notions, biases, prejudices. And you tell people you got to leave that at the door when you serve as a member of the jury. But the reality is, you carry that baggage with you always. And so I agree. It's kind of ironic that the videos themselves that kind of were the thing that resonated globally in terms of the death of George Floyd was something that they were looking to have these members of the jury not know about. But that is why it's been so critical that the prosecution has done its presentation by starting with the civilian witnesses and then going to the officers' body cam videos themselves. And now we're moving on into the police use of force experts. And now we're in the medical experts. And so that is why the actual presentation of this case is theater, Chris. Trial is theater. And so the state has basically said, we are going to take you through this journey. And at the end, we're going to ask you to convict. And you know what? Dave is right. There's 3 different charges. They only have to pick one. They don't have to do all 3. And Derek Chauvin's going to get lit up. And so really, Chauvin's got a lot of exposure here. And his attorney is doing the best that I think he can with very little on that menu for him to choose from.
Well, on that note, Dave, we're expecting the prosecution arrest next week. Again, this is there's 2 kind of countervailing forces here. One is that it is hard to convict police officers. We've seen this time and time again. On the other hand, this was one of the most egregious and documented uses of force by a police officer to cause someone's death that we've seen in a very long time. What do you expect from the defense next week?
So I agree with what you're saying. It's actually a double whammy. On the one hand, you have to convict a police officer. You're also trying to convict someone of an unintentional murder, which is always hard. In terms of the defense, I think they're going to stick to the same, I'm going to say, tired approach they've taken, and that is to try to blame alternate causes, underlying health issues, and drug use as a causative factors. It's basically dog whistling. On the one hand, I despise that. At the same time, it tends to work. You have to remember, some people saw this video and they put Blue Lives Matter signs up in their front yard. But I have to say this, in terms of balanced legal analysis, this was not the right way for the defense to try this case. And this hints at a bigger issue that's associated with this trial. Derek Chauvin alone is not on trial. American policing is on trial. And part of the problem with the way this case has been presented is it's hard to draw the distinction between effective trial strategy and what's actually good in real life. I think it was effective trial strategy to basically insert a commercial for the Minneapolis Police Department, which we've received in this trial. Because if you have a Blue Lives Matter juror, you don't want to alienate them. At the same time, we've done that at the expense of holding the Minneapolis Police Department accountable for the role they played in this. Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. He deserves to be convicted. But part of the reason that happened is because of inadequate training and supervision and policies that enabled him to do it in the first place. Because let's not forget, there were 3 police officers there with him when he did that. And I think that had the defense taken that approach, what my guy did was wrong, but it's part of a much bigger systemic problem. He could have calculated potentially being convicted of manslaughter, which would not be a win for the community, or possibly being acquitted with some likelihood of anticipating the outcome of the trial.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.